Why medieval prisons were worse than you think to the forgotten souls who languished in the damp, dark corners of medieval prisons. May your suffering, however grim and absurd, serve as a chilling reminder of the fragility of justice and the enduring need for humane treatment of all, even the most undeserving among us. This book is dedicated to you, not in romanticized glory, but in sober remembrance. May your nameless stories finally find a voice, even if it's delivered with a gallows humor that mirrors the grim irony of your existence. To the countless jailers, judges, and torturers throughout history whose names are lost to time, but whose actions echo through the centuries, your deeds, however deplorable, provide a vital case study in how not to administer justice. While we may never fully understand the motivations behind your cruelty, we can learn from the horrific consequences of your choices. This dedication is not an endorsement of your methods, but rather a grim acknowledgment of your role in shaping the complex evolution, or perhaps devolution, of penal systems. Your legacy, like the stench of a medieval jail, lingers. To those who believe that history is best served with a hearty dose of dark humor, may this book serve as a testament to the bizarre and often grotesque absurdity of the past. It is my sincere hope that in dissecting the grim realities of medieval prisons, we can find not only understanding, but also a spark of laughter in the face of utter despair. After all, what's a little gallows humor among friends and historians? Let the ghosts of those who endured far worse than a chuckle share in the grim amusement. To the readers of this book, thank you for braving the depths of medieval incarceration. Your curiosity about the past serves as a vital reminder that history holds valuable lessons, even when those lessons are tinged with the acrid aroma of decay, vermin, and unchecked cruelty. May your journey through these pages leave you not merely informed, but also profoundly grateful for the relatively more civilized conditions of our modern world, however flawed those conditions may be. And let's be honest, let's hope our prisons never again reach the level of imaginative horror detailed within. Remember that even amidst the darkness of the past, there is always a glimmer of light, a chance to learn, and a reason to laugh even in the face of absurdity. May this book help guide you along the way. Chapter 1, The Iron Cage, Life Inside Medieval Prisons. The air hung thick and heavy, a miasma of decay and despair. Imagine, if you will, stepping through a low, arched doorway into a world where darkness clung to the damp stone walls like a shroud. This wasn't the romantic dungeon of a Gothic novel. This was the reality of a medieval prison, a place where the very air seemed to breed disease and hopelessness. Forget flickering candlelight and dramatic shadows. The illumination, if it could be called that, was provided by the weak, wavering light filtering through a grimy barred window, barely penetrating the perpetual gloom. The floor, if you could even call it that, was a treacherous expanse of packed earth, slick with a mixture of spilled urine, rotting food, and something far more sinister that your imagination is better left to fill in. The stench was overpowering, a suffocating blend of mildew, human waste, and the ever-present aroma of decay. It was a smell that clung to your clothes, your skin, your very soul, a constant reminder of the squalor in which you were forced to exist. The walls themselves were cold, damp, and porous, exuding a chilling dampness that seeped into your bones. Imagine the chill penetrating your thin, threadbare clothing, a constant reminder of the unrelenting cold that gnawed at your flesh. There were no blankets, no mattresses, only the hard, unforgiving earth to lie upon, often shared with others equally unfortunate. In some places, straw might have been scattered, straw that had long since absorbed the filth of countless inmates and was likely crawling with vermin. Fleas, lice, and rats were not merely unwelcome guests, they were unwelcome residents, sharing your cramped space, feasting on your flesh, and spreading disease with alarming efficiency. Overcrowding was a defining feature of medieval prisons. Cells designed for one or two individuals might easily house a dozen or more. Men, women, and sometimes even children were crammed together in a space barely large enough to allow them to sit, let alone stand or move about freely. Personal space was a forgotten luxury. Physical contact was unavoidable, a constant source of discomfort and aggravation, not to mention a breeding ground for disease. Privacy was utterly non-existent. Every bodily function, every whispered conversation, every moment of despair was shared with your fellow inmates. Forget the image of solitary confinement as a method of punishment. In a medieval prison, confinement was punishment enough, a relentless and inescapable test of endurance. The sheer proximity of others, the constant noise, the stench, the vermin, it all contributed to a psychological and physical torment that was far more devastating than any form of physical torture. Hygiene was an alien concept. Water was a precious commodity, often scarce, and only grudgingly provided. Washing was a luxury that most prisoners could only dream of. Imagine the grime accumulating on bodies, the matted hair, the festering wounds, the relentless itch of parasites. It was a living hell, a physical manifestation of societal neglect and the utter disregard for the human dignity of those imprisoned. The lack of sanitation was appalling. There were no toilets, no proper drainage, only chamber pots that overflowed with horrifying regularity. Human waste was often simply left to accumulate, adding to the already overpowering stench. The air was thick with disease-carrying bacteria and viruses. Dysentery, typhoid, and typhus were commonplace, regularly decimating the prison population. Death was a constant companion, a grim reaper patiently waiting in the wings, claiming victims with callous indifference. But death wasn't always swift. Often, it was a long, agonizing process, marked by wasting disease, festering sores, and the slow, inexorable decay of the body. Imagine the sounds, the constant coughing, the ragged breaths, the moans of pain, the unsettling silence of the dead, the constant presence of death, both near and far, created a palpable atmosphere of fear and despair. It wasn't simply the fear of death itself, but the knowledge that death could come at any moment, in any manner, from any cause, and that it would be a protracted and agonizing experience. The physical reality of imprisonment in a medieval prison was far removed from the popularized images. This wasn't a place of dark intrigue and brooding heroes. It was a place of abject squalor, disease, and death, where the very act of survival demanded an incredible resilience and an almost supernatural ability to endure suffering beyond human comprehension. The iron cage wasn't just a metaphor, it was a grim reality, a suffocating confinement that stripped away human dignity and left behind only a relentless battle for survival. The experience warped the body and mind, leaving indelible scars that extended far beyond the prison walls, even after release. Imagine escaping the prison only to carry the stench, the disease, the memories within you, a constant reminder of the brutal and inhuman conditions that had defined your existence. This is not a tale of daring escapes and heroic defiance. It's the stark, unvarnished truth of a life lived in the shadow of death and despair. Let us consider the layout of these prisons themselves. They were often located in existing structures, repurposed castles, abandoned buildings, even sections of monasteries, not purpose-built facilities. The spaces were irregular, poorly lit, and often poorly ventilated. Light wells were infrequent and usually small, offering little respite from the pervasive gloom. Ventilation was at best inadequate, trapping the odors and disease-carrying particles within the prison walls. The lack of fresh air, compounded by overcrowding and the lack of sanitation, contributed to the spread of disease, making these environments some of the most unhealthy in medieval society. Sometimes, prisoners were kept in subterranean dungeons, spaces literally carved out of the earth, dank and cold, and often prone to flooding. Imagine the darkness, the ever-present threat of flooding, the complete absence of natural light, and the constant dampness that seeped into every pore of your being. In these conditions, disease ran rampant, and the very air itself seemed to be poisonous. It was a world removed from the sun, a world where despair was palpable, where hope was a distant, unattainable dream. And the sounds, the cacophony of human misery, was a constant companion. The coughs, groans, and cries of the sick and dying, the incessant rattling of chains, the shuffling of feet, the mumbled prayers, it all contributed to a symphony of suffering, a relentless assault on the senses that left no room for peace or tranquility. Even the simple act of sleeping was a torment. There were no beds, no comfortable places to rest, just the hard, damp earth, often shared with other prisoners and swarming with vermin. Sleep, if it could be called that, was a fragmented, restless affair, punctuated by the discomfort of the cold, the bites of insects, and the chilling awareness of the shared misery all around. The cold was a constant, insidious enemy. Medieval prisons were poorly heated, often located in cold, damp basements or cellars. In winter, the cold was merciless, penetrating to the bone. Prisoners, often clad in rags or nothing at all, shivered constantly, their bodies constantly battling against the elements. The cold exacerbated the effects of disease, weakened the immune system, and made even the simplest of tasks an almost unbearable struggle. In short, the physical realities of imprisonment in a medieval prison were profoundly dehumanizing. It was a brutal, degrading existence, designed to strip prisoners of their dignity and reduce them to a state of helpless despair. It was a reality far removed from the romanticized images often found in popular culture, a harsh an unforgiving environment that laid bare the cruel realities of medieval justice, the lack of basic human necessities, the constant threat of disease and death, and the dehumanizing conditions created an existence that was both physically and psychologically devastating, shaping the lives of prisoners in ways unimaginable to us today. This was not simply punishment, it was a descent into a living hell. The iron bars, cold and unforgiving, were a constant reminder of the prisoner's plight. But the true gnawing torment often came not from the chill of the stone, but from the emptiness in their bellies. Bread and bones, that was the often repeated jest, a cruel irony considering the scarcity of even those meager provisions. The diet of a medieval prisoner was a testament to the casual disregard for human life, a deliberate instrument of suffering woven into the very fabric of imprisonment. Forget the romantic notions of crusty loaves and hearty stews. The reality was far grimmer. The bread, if provided at all, was frequently stale, moldy, and riddled with weevils, a testament to the haphazard nature of prison management and the sheer indifference to the prisoner's well-being. It was often coarse barley bread, barely edible, a far cry from the finer loaves enjoyed by the free population. The amount offered was laughably insufficient, a few meager slices that did little to satisfy the gnawing hunger that perpetually plagued the inmates. It was a constant, dull ache, a persistent reminder of their powerlessness and deprivation. Occasionally, a scrap of meat might find its way into a prisoner's bowl, though meat was often a generous term for the tough, sinewy scraps, discarded offcuts from the kitchen of the jailer or even the town butcher. Often, it was simply bones, gnawed clean of any palatable flesh, tossed into the communal pot as a cruel mockery of sustenance. The sight of these meager rations, the stale bread, the inedible scraps, became a ritualistic humiliation, a daily reminder of their abject poverty and social degradation. The variations in the quality and quantity of food were often arbitrary and cruel. Wealthier prisoners, those who could afford to bribe the guards, might receive slightly better rations, a few extra slices of bread, or perhaps a somewhat less rancid piece of meat. But such privileges were the exception, not the rule, highlighting the pervasive inequality within even the confines of a medieval prison. This inequality wasn't a matter of fairness, but a tool of control, wielded to foster resentment and competition among the prisoners. Starvation was a constant threat, a slow, agonizing process that eroded both the body and the spirit. The prisoners' bodies became gaunt and emaciated, their limbs weak and trembling. The constant hunger induced a state of lethargy, making it difficult to even stand, let alone work. The skin became stretched and dry, the eyes sunken and hollow. The hair, often matted with filth and lice, lost its luster and became brittle. The effects of malnutrition extended far beyond mere physical weakness. The constant hunger and the resultant lack of energy contributed to a state of profound despair. The prisoners' minds became clouded, their thoughts sluggish and disoriented. The sharp edges of hope and ambition dulled, replaced by a pervasive sense of hopelessness. The will to resist, to fight for survival, was gradually eroded by the relentless pressure of hunger. The psychological impact of chronic starvation was devastating. The prisoners were constantly preoccupied with thoughts of food, their imaginations tormented by vivid images of meals they would never experience. They would spend hours dreaming of sumptuous banquets, rich foods, and the sheer pleasure of a full stomach. These fantasies, while offering fleeting moments of escape, also served as a constant reminder of their deprivation. Disease, frequently a companion of hunger, flourished in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval prisons. Malnutrition significantly weakened the prisoners' immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to a range of illnesses: dysentery, typhoid, scurvy. These were not infrequent visitors, frequently exacerbated by the lack of adequate nutrition and the scarcity of potable water. Infections festered, healing slowly or not at all, due to the body's inability to fight back effectively. A minor cut could become a serious, life-threatening infection. The lack of medical attention only compounded the problem. Medical care in the medieval period was rudimentary at best, and prisons were rarely a priority for healthcare professionals. Many died from preventable illnesses, succumbing to diseases that could have been treated if even basic care had been provided. The deaths were often slow and agonizing, adding to the overall atmosphere of despair and hopelessness. Food, or rather the lack of it, was frequently used as a tool of punishment. Prisoners who had angered their jailers or who had attempted to escape were often denied rations entirely. They were left to endure excruciating hunger, a torment that could be as effective as any physical torture. This form of punishment was particularly effective, as it played on the prisoner's most basic survival instincts. The use of food as a means of control permeated the entire prison system. The distribution of food, often haphazard and unpredictable, was a constant source of anxiety and tension. Prisoners would often fight amongst themselves for scraps of food, creating a climate of fear and violence. This atmosphere of tension and competition further weakened the prisoners' morale and made them more susceptible to manipulation by the authorities. Even the seemingly minor aspects of food distribution were imbued with a sense of cruelty. The small portions, the inedible scraps, the frequent withholding of rations. All of this contributed to a sense of systematic dehumanization. The prisoners were treated not as individuals with basic needs, but as objects to be controlled and manipulated. In essence, the bread and bones diet of medieval prisoners was not just a matter of inadequate sustenance. It was a deliberate strategy of punishment, a tool of control, and a symbol of the dehumanizing nature of imprisonment. The constant hunger, the associated diseases, and the psychological impact of starvation combined to create a brutal and unrelenting experience that stripped prisoners of their dignity and left them in a state of abject despair. The system was designed not simply to punish, but to break the human spirit, and hunger was a potent instrument to that end. The absence of even basic sustenance served as a stark reminder of the utter disregard for human life within the walls of the medieval prison. The chilling reality transcended mere deprivation. It was a calculated cruelty, a systematic undermining of human resilience. Beyond the gnawing hunger, a different kind of iron grip constricted the lives of medieval prisoners. Chains. These weren't the romanticized, clinking shackles of a swashbuckler film. They were brutal instruments of confinement, designed not just to restrain, but to inflict suffering. The sheer weight of iron, constantly pressing against flesh, caused chafing, sores, and infections. Imagine the simple act of sleeping, a basic human need, transformed into an agonizing experience as the chains dug into your skin, restricting movement, hindering any possibility of comfortable rest. This constant pressure, both physical and psychological, chipped away at the prisoner's resolve, a slow, relentless torture. The types of chains varied, depending on the severity of the crime and the perceived threat of escape. For minor offenders, perhaps a simple ankle chain might suffice, allowing a degree of limited movement within a cell. But for more serious crimes, or for those deemed particularly dangerous, the restraints were far more elaborate and debilitating. Leg irons, heavy and unforgiving, could be connected to a wall or even another prisoner, ensuring absolute immobility. These weren't delicate pieces of craftsmanship. They were crude, heavy metal, often poorly maintained, leading to rust and further skin irritation. Imagine the constant clanking, a grim soundtrack to their misery, a relentless reminder of their captivity. Handcuffs, too, played their part in this symphony of suffering. Unlike their modern counterparts, medieval handcuffs were designed not for simple restraint, but for maximum discomfort. They were often crudely made, with rough edges digging into the wrists, causing inflammation and pain. They were frequently left on for prolonged periods, resulting in swelling and stiffness, making even basic tasks such as eating or drinking a challenge. The constant pressure on the nerves and blood vessels could lead to numbness, tingling, and ultimately permanent damage. But the real ingenuity of medieval cruelty extended beyond simple chains and cuffs. There was a whole panoply of restraining devices, each more inventive and horrifying than the last. Consider the stocks, a public form of humiliation and confinement. The stocks were a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, leaving the prisoner exposed to the elements and the derision of the populace. Imagine the shame and the pain, the sun beating down on your exposed skin, the rain soaking you to the bone, the constant stream of jeers and taunts from the onlookers. It was a punishment designed to break a person's spirit as much as their body. The pillory, a similar device, served a similar purpose, but with a slightly different twist. The pillory consisted of a wooden board with holes for the head and hands, usually placed in a public square. The prisoner was left exposed for hours, or even days, to the scorn and abuse of passers-by. Food and drink might be withheld, compounding the discomfort. The psychological torment was immense, as the prisoner was forced to endure the relentless humiliation, a slow, agonizing erosion of self-esteem and dignity. Shackles, often used in conjunction with chains, were another layer of medieval barbarity. These were heavy iron rings, fastened around the ankles or wrists, usually with a lock or bar. They were designed to restrict movement completely, making it impossible to escape or even to perform basic bodily functions without assistance. They could be used in conjunction with chains, further restricting mobility and increasing the level of discomfort. The weight of the shackles could be considerable, leading to fatigue, muscle strain, and even permanent damage to the joints. The application of these various forms of restraint wasn't random. It reflected a deep-seated belief in corporal punishment and the public display of justice. The severity of the restraint directly corresponded to the severity of the crime. A petty thief might find themselves shackled to a post in the town square, while a murderer or a traitor might be subjected to a far more elaborate and brutal regime of chains and confinement, perhaps even spending years in shackles, chained to a wall, or even another prisoner. Beyond the immediate physical pain, the constant presence of chains had a profound psychological impact on the prisoner. The constant awareness of restraint fostered a sense of powerlessness and helplessness. The clanking of chains became a constant reminder of their imprisonment, a symbol of their lost freedom and shattered dignity. Sleep became difficult as the chains chafed and restricted movement. Even simple tasks, like eating and drinking, became a struggle. The use of chains was also a practical tool designed to prevent escape. While medieval prisons weren't exactly high security institutions, chains significantly reduced the possibility of a breakout. This pragmatic aspect should not minimize the cruelty and inhumanity of the system. The use of chains as a means of confinement was brutal, and it contributed to the overall atmosphere of oppression and despair that characterized medieval prisons. Beyond the obvious physical effects, the psychological toll was devastating. The constant awareness of one's physical restraint created a sense of utter powerlessness. The knowledge that escape was impossible led to despair and hopelessness. The constant chafing of the chains against the skin, the relentless weight of the iron, these became symbols of the prisoner's subjugation. The mind, too, was imprisoned, confined to a world of darkness and despair. Furthermore, the lack of hygiene added another layer to the suffering. The chains themselves were rarely cleaned, becoming breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. This resulted in skin infections, sores, and other ailments that further exacerbated the prisoner's misery. In this unsanitary environment, even a minor wound could become a major problem, leading to gangrene, sepsis, and even death. The chains, designed to confine the body, also trapped the prisoner in a cycle of pain and infection. The social implications of chains also deserve consideration. The very sight of chains was a symbol of social degradation, a public declaration of the prisoner's guilt and social outcast status. Being chained was not simply a form of physical restraint, it was a public branding, a mark of shame that followed the prisoner long after their release, if they were fortunate enough to be released at all. The sight of a person in chains served as a warning to others, reinforcing the power of the state and the fear of its justice, or lack thereof. And let's not forget the role of the jailer. The use of chains provided another tool for the jailer to exert his power and control. He could use the chains to punish prisoners, tightening them to cause pain or restricting movement even further. He could also use the chains to reward obedience or compliance, offering a degree of comfort or relief from the constant pressure of the iron. This created a system of arbitrary and capricious punishment, where the jailer's whim determined the level of suffering endured by the prisoner. The jailer's power, often unchecked, made the use of chains a potent symbol of his authority. Finally, the economic aspect of chains also warrants attention. The production and maintenance of chains represented a significant cost, underlining the state's investment in brutal forms of punishment. The metal itself was expensive, requiring skilled craftsmanship and significant resources. The very existence of these elaborate systems of restraint points to the prioritization of punishment over rehabilitation. The money spent on chains could have been used for other things, such as providing food or health care, but instead it was invested in instruments of suffering, reflecting the medieval society's callous disregard for human life. In conclusion, chains and other forms of restraint in medieval prisons were more than simply tools of confinement. They were instruments of suffering designed to inflict both physical and psychological pain, to humiliate and degrade, and to exert power. They weren't merely practical measures. They were integral to the very philosophy of medieval justice, representing a dark and brutal aspect of the era. The iron cage was not just a place of confinement. It was a carefully crafted apparatus of systematic dehumanization, where the very act of being restrained was a constant, grinding torment. The clang of chains resonates through history, a stark reminder of the long and painful path towards a more humane, though still imperfect, system of justice. The sheer brutality of medieval prisons, as we've explored, was staggering. Chains, stocks, pillories. These were the tools of confinement, but the system itself, the very justice it purported to deliver, was often far more absurd than the instruments it employed. One might expect a degree of consistency, a predictable link between crime and punishment, but medieval justice was a chaotic dance of arbitrary decrees and wildly disproportionate penalties. Imagine, if you will, a world where stealing a loaf of bread to feed your starving family could land you in the same fetid dungeon as a nobleman accused of treason, though naturally the nobleman's cell might be slightly less aromatic. Let's begin with the concept of proof itself. Forget your modern notions of forensic evidence, airtight alibis, and impartial juries. In the medieval world, proof often relied heavily on things like ordeal by fire. Touch a red-hot iron. If your wound heals miraculously, you're innocent. Ordeal by water, thrown into a river, float and you're guilty, sink and, well, you're probably dead, but still technically innocent. And the ever-reliable testimony of witnesses whose reliability could be as unpredictable as a drunken badger in a henhouse. Consider the case of the unfortunate Agnes, accused of witchcraft. Agnes, it seems, had a rather unfortunate penchant for collecting herbs, which in the eyes of a particularly superstitious magistrate constituted incontrovertible evidence of her dabbling in dark arts. Her trial consisted of being forced to walk across a field of burning coals while reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards. Now, even if she had been a champion athlete, this would have been a grueling task. The fact that she tripped, slightly singed her hem, and burst into tears was interpreted as irrefutable evidence of her guilt. Agnes, despite her valiant attempt at maintaining her composure, ended up spending the rest of her days in a damp, rat-infested cell, presumably pondering the absurdities of a justice system that could equate herbalism with heresy. Then there was the matter of Thomas, a baker whose crime was making slightly underweight loaves of bread. The punishment? Having his bakery burned to the ground, while he watched, of course, shackled to a nearby post. The logic here remains frustratingly elusive. One suspects the real crime was offending the local lord, whose morning bread had been noticeably less substantial than usual. In comparison, someone who committed grand larceny and happened to be a friend of the judge might have been let off with a stern warning and perhaps a slight reduction in their next tax bill. Such was the whimsical nature of medieval justice. Social class played a significant role in determining the outcome of legal proceedings. A wealthy nobleman caught red-handed in a crime would frequently receive far more lenient treatment than a poor peasant accused of a far less serious offense. The justice system was not blind. It was remarkably observant and quite partial. The courts often favored the wealthy and powerful, wielding the full force of their authority and sometimes a well-placed bribe to protect their own interests. Take the case of Sir Reginald, a prominent knight accused of assaulting a traveling merchant. Despite several eyewitnesses, who admittedly were all relatively poor and therefore easily dismissed, Sir Reginald's influential connections ensured that the matter was swiftly and quietly swept under the rug. A small fine, a whispered apology to the merchant, which he never actually uttered, and Sir Reginald was free to go, his reputation largely unscathed. The merchant, on the other hand, was left to deal with his injuries and the loss of his goods with no hope of retribution. The laws themselves were often vague, contradictory, and subject to the whims of whoever held power at the time. One could find oneself committing a crime one day and being entirely innocent the next, simply based on a shift in the ruling magistrate's mood, or even a change in the prevailing winds. The ambiguity allowed for a significant level of flexibility, ensuring that the scales of justice were perpetually tipped towards those with the power to manipulate the system. One must also consider the widespread practice of trial by combat, a practice wherein the accused was given the opportunity to fight their accuser to the death. If the accused won, they were declared innocent. If they lost, well, they were declared dead. The sheer absurdity of this method is breathtaking. Not only did it often result in the death of innocent people, it also meant that the fitness and fighting abilities of the accused played a far greater role in the determination of guilt than the evidence itself. Imagine such a trial today, and the ensuing court case against the entire system of justice. The punishments themselves were often just as ludicrous as the trials. For example, a woman caught gossiping might find herself condemned to walk through the town square wearing a dunce cap adorned with images of her indiscretions. A man who had a slight disagreement with the town's blacksmith could have had his beard shaved off publicly, then be forced to run through the streets holding a chicken in each hand. These punishments, far from fitting the crimes, often served as entertainment for the community, a gruesome and morbid form of public spectacle. The lack of any semblance of due process is another striking characteristic of the medieval justice system. Trials were often hasty, unfair, and deeply biased. The accused rarely had the opportunity to present a defense, and even if they did, their pleas were often dismissed with callous disregard. Confessions were obtained through torture, intimidation, and occasionally a well-placed threat to their family's well-being. Furthermore, appeals were virtually non-existent. The decision of the magistrate was final and absolute. There was no higher court to which one could appeal for justice. This made the whole system incredibly susceptible to corruption and abuse of power. A system with little or no appeal is essentially a system which encourages arbitrariness and self interest. The medieval justice system, viewed from a modern perspective, appears to be a dark tapestry woven with threads of absurdity, cruelty, and glaring inequality. It served as a tool of control and oppression, often reinforcing social hierarchies and perpetuating the suffering of the vulnerable. The lack of any real sense of fairness or consistency makes the entire enterprise seem like a macabre joke, a cruel comedy played out on the lives of countless individuals. The iron cage of medieval imprisonment was only one aspect of a far wider and equally disturbing cage constructed by a fundamentally flawed system of justice. The enduring legacy of this period is not just the horror of its prisons, but the chilling reminder of just how easily the pursuit of justice can devolve into arbitrary cruelty and unchecked power. It serves, ultimately, as a cautionary tale, a testament to the importance of due process, fairness, and the constant striving towards a more just and equitable society, however flawed that society might be. The iron cage of a medieval prison was not just a metaphor for confinement, it was a breeding ground for death. While the brutality of the justice system, the capricious nature of its application, and the stark inequalities it perpetuated were horrifying enough, the grim reality of disease added another layer of unspeakable suffering. The overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of these prisons were a perfect storm for the spread of infectious illness, transforming each cell into a miniature plague pit. Death in these places was not a distant possibility, but a frequent and unwelcome guest. Forget romantic notions of brooding, solitary confinement. The reality was far more visceral, a cacophony of coughs, groans, and the stench of decay. Imagine, if you will, a stone cell, damp and cold, crammed with more bodies than it was ever designed to hold. The air hangs thick with the smell of sweat, urine, and rotting food. Lice crawl through matted hair and burrow into threadbare clothing. Rats, fat and bold from a diet of human refuse, scamper across the floor, their beady eyes reflecting the flickering light of a single, meager torch. This was the everyday reality for those unfortunate enough to find themselves incarcerated in a medieval prison. This was not a place of rehabilitation or reflection. It was a slow, agonizing descent into sickness and death. The lack of sanitation was appalling. Toilets, if they existed at all, were rudimentary and grossly inadequate, overflowing with filth. Waste was often simply tossed onto the floor, mingling with the spilled food and general debris to create a fetid stew of disease-causing bacteria. Clean water was a luxury few prisoners enjoyed. Drinking water, often contaminated, was a likely contributor to the rampant spread of dysentery and typhoid. The very air they breathed was laden with disease-causing spores and bacteria, creating an environment ripe for infection. Several diseases thrived in this miasma of filth and despair. Dysentery, with its agonizing bouts of diarrhea and dehydration, was a constant threat. Typhoid fever, with its high fever, delirium, and internal bleeding, was a death sentence for many. Tuberculosis, with its relentless cough and wasting of the body, slowly consumed its victims. Scurvy, A deficiency disease caused by lack of vitamin C led to bleeding gums, swollen joints, and ultimately death. And then there were the skin infections and parasites, lice, fleas, scabies, all thriving in the unsanitary conditions. These diseases didn't merely spread, they thrived. The close proximity of the prisoners, the inadequate ventilation, and the sheer lack of hygiene ensured that an infection in one cell quickly became an epidemic across the whole prison. The already weakened bodies of the prisoners were extremely susceptible to infection, their immune systems weakened by malnutrition and stress. The sheer density of bodies in those confined spaces meant that a contagious disease could rapidly spread from one to another until a majority of the prisoners were affected. The prison itself became a vessel of infection, with any new prisoners instantly exposed to an array of diseases. Treatment for these diseases was, to put it mildly, inadequate. Medieval medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, often relying on practices that were not only ineffective, but sometimes actively harmful. Bleeding, purging, and the application of bizarre concoctions of herbs and animal parts were common, doing little to ease the suffering of the afflicted. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no understanding of the role of bacteria and viruses in the transmission of diseases. The only intervention would likely have been to put the sufferer in a quieter part of the prison, usually alone, to avoid spreading the disease, or to let them die. The mortality rate in medieval prisons was staggeringly high. Death was a constant companion, a fact accepted with a grim resignation by both prisoners and guards. Many prisoners succumbed to illness long before they served their sentences, their bodies frail and worn by disease and malnutrition. The cemeteries surrounding these prisons are haunting testament to the countless lives cut short. The very soil of these burial grounds would have been saturated with the remnants of disease, serving as a reservoir of infection. Consider the case of a prisoner suffering from tuberculosis. Their persistent cough would have filled the air with infectious droplets, easily inhaled by their fellow inmates. The symptoms of the disease, the hacking cough, the fever, the night sweats, the relentless wasting away, would have been a grim spectacle, a horrifying reminder of the ever-present threat of death. And once a prisoner became infected, their chances of survival were slim. Death would have been a relatively swift end when compared to the agony of the disease itself. The psychological impact of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. The constant fear of disease, coupled with the awareness of the high mortality rate, must have created a palpable atmosphere of dread. Hope, for many, was a vanishingly small ember, quickly extinguished in the suffocating darkness of their reality. The lack of any sense of hope and the pervasiveness of illness would have had a profound effect on prisoners' mental state, leaving them exhausted, terrified, and resigned to the inevitability of death. The sheer brutality of these conditions cannot simply be passed over with a cursory acknowledgment. It must be fully explored to understand the profound dehumanization inherent in the medieval prison system. It is impossible to comprehend the level of suffering endured by those confined within these walls. This was not merely incarceration. This was a slow, agonizing form of systematic extermination. The spread of disease, was not an unfortunate side effect. It was an integral part of the overall experience. The death rate was so high as to be not just a tragic element, but a structural feature of the medieval prison system, something which was virtually inevitable. The iron cage of medieval imprisonment wasn't merely a physical structure, it was a deadly trap, a place where the chances of survival were slim and where the relentless assault of disease added a final layer of terror to an already horrific existence. It serves not just as a grim reminder of the past, but also as a stark warning about the dangers of neglecting basic human rights and decency, even within the confines of a justice system. For those unfortunate enough to be incarcerated, life was short, brutal, and overwhelmingly likely to end not with a sentence served, but with an untimely death from sickness. The Grim Reaper was a constant and welcome guest within those walls. Chapter 2: Justice? A farce in several acts. The stench of disease clinging to the prison walls was a constant, but it wasn't the only form of medieval punishment that aimed to degrade and destroy. While the interior of a jail offered a slow, agonizing death by infection, the outside world presented a different kind of horror: public humiliation. The stocks and the pillory were not merely instruments of punishment, they were elaborate, theatrical displays of societal power designed to break the spirit and inflict lasting shame. Imagine the scene: a bustling marketplace, the air alive with the chatter of merchants and the bleating of sheep. Suddenly, a hush falls over the crowd as a condemned individual is dragged into the center, their body secured within the unforgiving wooden embrace of the stocks or pillory. The stocks, a simple yet brutally effective device, consisted of a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. The victim, often barefoot and exposed to the elements, was left to stand, or rather to endure, for hours, sometimes days. The discomfort was intense. The pressure on wrists and ankles, the chafing of rough wood against skin, the burning of the sun, or the biting chill of winter wind, all contributed to a torment, both physical and mental. But the physical pain was secondary to the psychological devastation. Imagine the jeers, the taunts, the spitting and the throwing of rotten fruit, the rain of insults that fell upon them. The public humiliation was not just a punishment, it was a ritualistic stripping away of dignity, designed to make an example of the condemned, to break their spirit before the eyes of the community. The pillory, a more elaborate contraption, offered even greater opportunities for public derision. The victim's head and hands were locked into separate holes, leaving them vulnerable to all sorts of abuse. The pillory was often raised several feet off the ground, making the condemned individual a target for all to see. The higher the platform, the more conspicuous and vulnerable the individual became. And then, of course, there was the matter of time. Hours could be spent exposed and helpless, subjected to the brutal indignities of the crowd. The offenses that led to such public displays of shame ran the gamut of medieval social transgressions. Theft, of course, was a common culprit, from petty pilfering to grand larceny. But the stocks and pillory weren't reserved only for common criminals. Those who dared to speak out against authority, dissenters who questioned the established order, could find themselves facing the wrath of the public. Even minor infractions, such as public drunkenness or brawling, could lead to a stint in the stocks, making it a potent tool for social control. The sheer variety of punishments meted out, depending on the perceived severity of the crime or the whim of the judge, was truly stunning. A baker who cheated his customers might find himself forced to sit in the stocks, while a blasphemer or seditionist could endure a longer or more agonizing sentence in the pillory. The creativity of punishment was matched only by the cruelty with which it was often delivered. The pillory itself might be intentionally uncomfortable, rough planks of wood designed to inflict abrasions and chafing. The stocks were equally unpleasant. The simple wooden constriction might be made even more painful through the addition of weights or other restrictions. There are numerous recorded accounts of people losing fingers or toes from the constriction of the wooden stocks. The sheer boredom, the relentless monotony of the ordeal must have been unbearable. The monotony, the boredom, and sheer helplessness, with only the relentless cycle of insults and abuse to break the monotony, must have been a torture worse than physical pain. The public aspect of the punishment was crucial. These were not simply acts of justice, they were public spectacles designed to entertain and reinforce social order. The crowd, a seething mass of onlookers, served as both judge and executioner. Their jeers and taunts, a form of collective punishment. It was a perverse entertainment, a macabre drama where the suffering of one provided amusement for many. There was a collective thrill in the humiliation, a satisfaction in seeing someone brought low. This reinforces the notion of medieval society as more communal and less individualistic than modern society. Justice was seen as a collective action and not just the responsibility of a court. The crowd's participation in the shaming of criminals reinforced their place within the social order and their support of the norms and expectations. The psychological effects of such public humiliation were profound and long-lasting. The shame, the degradation, the feeling of utter helplessness, these were wounds that could never fully heal. The experience left an indelible mark, one that extended beyond the duration of the punishment itself, forever shaping the lives of those who endured it. The social stigma that clung to those who had been subjected to public shaming could be crippling. It could affect their employment prospects, their relationships, and their overall social standing. It is likely that many who suffered from the indignity of public shaming were socially ostracized or banished from society entirely. Their social status would be ruined and their very life marred by the event. In some cases, it is very likely that it would be an unbearable burden that would ultimately lead them to suicide. Imagine the mental torment, the relentless barrage of insults, the feeling of utter vulnerability, the constant awareness of being judged and condemned. For those who endured the ordeal, it was a degradation far worse than imprisonment or even death. It was a profound attack on their sense of self, their dignity, their very identity. The shame they experienced would be a lasting stain upon their lives, and a testament to the harsh realities of justice in medieval times. Their identity as a member of society would be lost, leaving them a pariah, forever shunned and ostracized. The stocks and the pillory, far from being relics of a barbaric past, offer a chilling glimpse into the darker side of medieval society. They highlight not only the brutality of the punishments themselves, but also the perverse entertainment value that society derived from witnessing suffering. The public nature of these punishments reveals a fascination with pain and humiliation, a morbid curiosity that served to reinforce the power structures of the time. Even when considering the relatively harsh punishments available today, we can see a clear difference. The modern justice system, though still far from perfect, aims at rehabilitation and deterrence rather than public spectacle and humiliation. The shift in approach reflects a change in societal values and a greater emphasis on human dignity, even for those who have broken the law. While modern punishment might be seen as overly lenient by some, it also represents a progress away from the crude, often arbitrarily inflicted punishments of the medieval era. The use of public humiliation as a form of punishment speaks volumes about the attitudes and beliefs of medieval society. It underlines the importance of public order and the collective enforcement of norms. It displays, in a harsh way, the lack of emphasis on individual rights and privacy, and it emphasizes the extent to which the public was both a participant in and a beneficiary of the punishment of criminals and social deviants. The spectacle of public humiliation served to reinforce the established order and to deter potential wrongdoers, providing a stark reminder of the consequences of transgression. The use of the stocks and pillory also exposes the limitations of the medieval justice system, its propensity for arbitrary rulings, and its disregard for individual rights. Justice was often dispensed in a brutal and summary manner, focusing on punishment rather than rehabilitation or reform. The public nature of the punishment was not just for show, it was intended to generate fear and obedience, demonstrating the power of the authorities. It was a clear indication that the state held the right to inflict suffering and to humiliate its citizens at will. Looking back at this aspect of medieval life is not merely an academic exercise. It's a journey into the darkest corners of human nature. It's a reminder that while societies evolve and legal systems are reformed, certain impulses, the desire for vengeance, the need to exert control, the dark enjoyment of witnessing another's suffering, persist. Understanding the history of public humiliation in medieval Europe is not just a matter of historical interest, it's a vital exercise in understanding our own humanity, in its complexity and its contradictions. It's a reminder of the importance of constantly striving to improve our justice systems, to make them more just, more humane, and less likely to resort to such barbaric practices. The past, in this case, serves as a stark warning, a reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the importance of constant vigilance in the pursuit of a more just and equitable society. The grim realities of the stocks and pillory stand as a potent symbol of a time when justice was a cruel farce, played out for the entertainment of the masses. Let's leave the fetid air of the prison and the jeering crowds for a moment, and step into a world where justice was less a system and more a high-stakes gamble with the divine. I speak, of course, of trial by ordeal, a medieval practice so ludicrously illogical that it almost defies belief. Almost. Forget your sensible courtroom dramas, your carefully weighed evidence, and your impartial juries. Here, the fate of the accused rested not on facts or witnesses, but on their ability to survive a divinely ordained test of their innocence. Imagine, if you will, a damp, chilly morning, a nervous defendant, perhaps accused of theft, a surprisingly common charge in a society where finders keepers often held more sway than any legal code, stands before a hastily assembled crowd. The air crackles with nervous energy, a mixture of morbid curiosity and superstitious dread. The accused is not pleading their case to a judge. They are, in essence, pleading their case to God, a deity known for his capricious sense of justice, shall we say. The specifics of the ordeal varied, depending on the alleged crime, and let's be honest, the whims of the local clergy who oversaw these theological lotteries. One of the most popular and arguably most spectacularly painful was trial by fire. Now, you wouldn't think God would be particularly impressed by someone's ability to withstand a good roasting, but in the medieval mind, the logic was irrefutable. The accused would have to walk a certain distance across burning coals or hold a red-hot iron. The absence of severe burns was, naturally, interpreted as a divine sign of innocence. Any blisters, however, or God forbid, any charred bits of flesh, screamed guilt. Of course, the process wasn't entirely without its enhancements. The preparation of the coals, for instance, was a rather subjective affair. A sympathetic priest might opt for a relatively tame pile of embers, while a less forgiving one might be rather more generous with the kindling. Similarly, the length of the walk could be adjusted, and let's not forget the occasional helpful suggestion that a little holy water on the affected area before judgment would surely assist in the speedy healing process. Helpful for the healers, perhaps, but not so much for the defendant. Then there was trial by water, a method almost as appealing as a root canal performed by a drunken blacksmith. The accused, often bound hand and foot, imagine the comfort, would be tossed into a body of water, a river, a pond, or even a conveniently placed well. If they floated, they were deemed guilty. If they sank and survived the submersion, they were deemed innocent. This brilliant system, naturally, ignored several inconvenient factors, including the buoyancy of the human body, the quality of the water, and the rather significant risk of drowning. One can almost imagine the cleric offering pre-trial advice to a prospective swimmer. Now remember deep breaths and try not to think too hard about that rather significant risk of drowning, but do try to sink. It's a matter of trust, really. Faith, if you will. Consider the plight of poor Thomas, a humble miller accused of stealing a particularly plump goose. Thomas, a man whose knowledge of theology was far surpassed by his knowledge of flour, was subjected to trial by water. The local priest, a rather portly fellow with a fondness for rich pastries and not so subtle hints of bribery, seemed oddly unconcerned as Thomas began to sink. Rapidly, it must be added. Alas, as Thomas's head disappeared beneath the surface, the priest's unconcern was momentarily replaced by a flicker of panicked concern. It turned out he'd rather liked the miller's bread. Thomas's survival, however, was largely attributed to the intervention of a conveniently placed submerged rock, upon which Thomas managed to snag a breath before being promptly pulled from the water. Naturally, he was declared innocent, although his lack of enthusiastic swimming skills undoubtedly raised a few eyebrows. And let us not forget the ordeal of the consecrated morsel. This delightfully subtle approach involved the accused swallowing a piece of bread or cheese supposedly blessed by a priest. If the bread or cheese was easily digested, innocence was assured. If, however, it stubbornly refused to pass through the accused's system, that was undoubtedly a sign of divine displeasure. One can only imagine the frantic, silent prayers of the accused, desperately hoping that God would ease their digestive tract. A lack of regular bowel movements would be a matter of great concern to the defendant, naturally. Many an unfortunate individual probably suffered from severe constipation during this trial, their suffering considered proof of guilt, of course. The sheer absurdity of these methods is stunning. They offer a fascinating glimpse into a world where logic and evidence were trumped by superstition and fear. The supposed fairness of a divine judgment ignores the possibility of human error, deliberate manipulation, or plain bad luck. It also reveals, not surprisingly, a deep-seated belief in the efficacy of divine intervention in the most mundane of human affairs. It's tempting to dismiss trial by ordeal as a relic of a primitive past, a quaint and ludicrous superstition, but its very existence underscores a crucial point about the nature of justice, both then and now. It highlights the inherent human desire to find a way to determine guilt or innocence, even when the means are demonstrably flawed, and perhaps even when the methods are wildly cruel. The systems of justice, no matter how sophisticated, will always be imperfect reflections of the societies that create them. The inconsistencies, the blatant disregard for due process, and the sheer, breathtaking unfairness of it all serve as a chilling reminder of how easily justice can be corrupted, perverted, and reduced to a farce. It's a dark mirror to our own attempts to achieve a fair and impartial justice system, reminding us of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. It's a story of faith, superstition, and the enduring human desire to find a scapegoat, even if it means risking a few charred fingers or a slightly soggy demise. And of course, a testament to the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, especially when faced with a rather soggy and potentially lethal outcome. It was, in its own peculiar way, a form of justice, medieval in its brutality and absurdity. Yet, by its very existence, it tells us something far more profound about the nature of humanity itself and our perpetual, sometimes frantic, quest for justice. Having witnessed the farcical nature of trial by ordeal, let's delve into a subject even less pleasant: the systematic use of torture to extract confessions. Forget the romantic notions of chivalrous knights and fair maidens. Medieval justice often involved a grim ballet of pain, inflicted not for any reasoned purpose, but for a twisted concoction of vengeance, fear, and a deeply flawed belief in the efficacy of forced confessions. The methods employed were as varied as they were brutal. The rack, a terrifying contraption of ropes and pulleys, stretched the victim's body to its breaking point, dislocating joints and causing excruciating pain. The thumbscrew, a smaller, more intimate instrument of torture, focused its cruel attention on the delicate bones of the hands, crushing them slowly and methodically. The Iron Maiden, a grim sarcophagus lined with spikes, offered a swift if visually dramatic end to prolonged questioning. And let's not forget the more creative, though no less horrific techniques: branding with hot irons, flogging with whips, or the wonderfully imaginative Spanish tickler, a device whose description alone is enough to induce a shudder. The application of these tortures wasn't haphazard. There was a certain grim choreography to the process, a macabre dance between the torturer and the victim. The aim wasn't necessarily to kill the accused, at least not immediately. The goal was to break their will, to reduce them to a whimpering, pleading mass of broken flesh and shattered spirit, willing to confess to anything, regardless of its truth. And that's the critical point: the unreliability of confessions extracted under duress. A medieval confession was more a testament to the torturer's skill than to the accused's guilt. Anyone subjected to prolonged physical and psychological torment would confess to virtually anything to make the pain stop. The confession of a man who'd been subjected to a week on the rack was far more likely to be dictated by the torturer's imagination than by the facts of the case. Imagine the pressure, the excruciating pain, the crushing fear of further torment, the constant awareness of one's own physical fragility. Any false confession was a small price to pay for the cessation of unimaginable agony. The medieval torturer was a master manipulator, a puppeteer who controlled the narrative of the confession through the careful application of pain and the insidious drip feed of false promises and threats. However, motivations for the use of torture went beyond the simple desire for a confession. Sometimes, torture served as a form of public spectacle, a form of entertainment for the masses. The gruesome details of a torture session could provide an hour or two's distraction from the drudgery of daily life, not unlike modern reality television, but with a distinctly medieval flavor. A crowd could revel in the victim's suffering, their collective sense of justice appeased by witnessing the brutal punishment of the alleged criminal, regardless of whether or not said criminal was in fact guilty. In other instances, torture was motivated by a simpler, more primal urge: pure vengeance. If a lord suspected a vassal of treachery, or if a family sought revenge for a perceived slight, torture could provide a means to settle scores, regardless of the legal niceties of the situation. The legal system was often used as a veneer, providing a twisted, quasi-legitimate way to unleash long-simmering grievances under the guise of justice. This wasn't about discovering truth. It was about inflicting pain. The inherent biases within the system further complicated matters. The wealthy and powerful often enjoyed significant protection from the full brunt of the law, including the threat of torture. Conversely, the poor and powerless, with little or no legal representation, were readily subjected to the most brutal interrogations. The medieval justice system was not blind. It was profoundly prejudiced, a system stacked against the already disadvantaged, ensuring a higher likelihood of conviction for those who could not afford the luxury of influence or protection. Consider a scenario: a poor farmer accused of stealing a lord's sheep. He protests his innocence, but his cries are drowned out by the evidence of the missing livestock. The lord, eager to avoid the inconvenience of a proper investigation, and perhaps a little inclined to publicly exercise his power, orders the farmer to be tortured. Within a few hours of the rack's relentless work, the farmer confesses. His confession, extracted under immense duress, is accepted as evidence of guilt. He is then punished severely, his life reduced to a cruel irony, punished for a crime he might not have committed. His punishment, a perverse spectacle confirming the social hierarchies of the time. The contrast with modern approaches to obtaining confessions is striking. While our justice system is far from perfect, it's still a vast improvement on the medieval model. Modern legal systems, at least ideally, emphasize due process, the right to legal representation, and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. The use of torture to extract confessions is unequivocally illegal, and confessions obtained through coercion are inadmissible in court. Modern interrogation techniques focus on psychological manipulation rather than physical brutality, though debates continue about whether even these methods are always ethical. The shift away from torture marks a significant, albeit imperfect, advance in the pursuit of justice. It reflects a growing understanding that confessions extracted through violence are fundamentally unreliable and ethically repugnant. Yet, even today, echoes of the medieval approach linger in certain corners of the world, a reminder of how easily the pursuit of justice can be derailed into a descent into cruelty and the perversion of truth. The medieval era's reliance on torture and the sheer casual brutality with which it was employed highlights the inherent dangers of a justice system that prioritizes fear and coercion over reason, fairness, and the pursuit of genuine truth. The very concept of a confession acquired a grotesque new dimension in the medieval era. It wasn't a moment of remorseful self-reflection, a clear-headed acknowledgment of wrongdoing. Instead, it became a twisted performance, a carefully orchestrated dance of pain and submission, the final desperate act in a brutal drama where the lines between truth and falsehood were hopelessly blurred. The confession itself became a commodity, a piece of evidence manufactured through suffering and accepted as a validation of pre-existing biases. The lack of procedural safeguards was staggering. There were no impartial judges, no rights to legal counsel. The accused was at the mercy of the accuser, the torturer, and the fickle whims of the local authorities. The entire system was built on assumptions, on suspicion, and importantly, on the unequal distribution of power. It was a system that protected those in power while leaving the vulnerable and powerless utterly exposed. The rich could afford to bribe their way out of trouble, while the poor could only hope for divine intervention or the mercy of a sufficiently bored torturer. It was a cruel lottery of faith and circumstance. It is impossible to read about medieval justice without a growing sense of unease. The brutality, the sheer senselessness of it all is enough to make one question the very nature of justice itself. The concept of finding truth through torture is inherently flawed. It is a violent subversion of reason, a cynical game played at the expense of the accused's physical and mental well-being. The enduring legacy of medieval torture reminds us that the struggle for true justice is an ongoing, ever-evolving process, a relentless pursuit of fairness and truth in the face of ingrained biases, power imbalances, and the constant temptation to inflict pain under the guise of retribution. The horrifyingly efficient system of medieval torture provides a chilling cautionary tale, a reminder that the search for truth should never come at the cost of human dignity. The path to justice, then and now, is a narrow and winding one, fraught with the risk of veering into the dark abyss of abuse and cruelty. And sometimes, the journey itself is far more brutal than the destination. The shadow of the church loomed large over the medieval landscape, its influence seeping into every aspect of life, including, and perhaps especially, the administration of justice. While secular courts wrestled with the practicalities of maintaining order, the church offered a potent spiritual framework, shaping perceptions of crime and punishment with a potent cocktail of divine wrath and mortal sin. Forget the image of benevolent priests offering solace. The church's involvement often added layers of complexity and frequently more cruelty to the already brutal system. The church's power stemmed not just from its spiritual authority, but also from its extensive network of courts and its ability to influence secular rulers. Ecclesiastical courts handled cases involving clerical personnel and matters deemed to fall under canon law, such as heresy, marriage annulments, and various moral transgressions. This dual system, secular and ecclesiastical, often led to jurisdictional disputes and overlapping authority, creating a confusing and often contradictory maze for the unfortunate accused. Imagine a scenario: a blacksmith accused of theft. The secular court might sentence him to fines, imprisonment, or even corporal punishment. But if the theft involved sacrilegious elements, say stealing from the church itself, then the ecclesiastical court would step in, adding layers of penance and spiritual retribution onto the secular sentence. The blacksmith might not only face flogging and a stint in the town jail, but also years of public penance, including wearing a distinctive garment of shame or performing arduous acts of religious service. This intertwining of secular and religious justice led to some fascinating and disturbing ambiguities. The concept of divine justice was often invoked to justify exceptionally harsh punishments, rationalizing cruelty with the claim of God's will. The severity of the sentence often depended on the perceived gravity of the sin in the eyes of the church. Adultery, heresy, and blasphemy, for instance, carried significantly heavier penalties than petty theft or assault, often leading to execution or prolonged suffering. The church's influence extended beyond the formal legal proceedings. The concept of penance, a cornerstone of Catholic doctrine, significantly influenced the types of punishments administered. Penance wasn't simply a matter of saying a few prayers. It involved acts of contrition, public humiliation, and often physical suffering. Imagine a woman accused of witchcraft, found guilty by a secular court. Her sentence might include being branded, imprisoned, and then subjected to a grueling regime of religious penance, forced attendance at daily masses, wearing a sackcloth, and reciting long penitential psalms. The church's emphasis on the spiritual aspect of crime led to bizarre and inconsistent applications of justice. Consider the case of two individuals accused of murder. One, a nobleman, might have his earthly punishment mitigated through financial reparations and a short period of house arrest, potentially aided by influential church officials. The other, a peasant, might face a gruesome public execution, despite any mitigating circumstances. The same crime, yet vastly different punishments, reflecting the profound social and economic inequalities inherent in the system. The inherent inconsistencies of divine justice are particularly striking. The same act could attract wildly different punishments depending on the context, the social standing of the accused, and the whims of both the secular and ecclesiastical authorities. One could argue this was a reflection of divine inscrutability, but a more pragmatic interpretation would point to the self-serving nature of a system that conveniently served the interests of both the church and the powerful. Moreover, the church's influence on punishment extended to the methods themselves. Public displays of penitence, such as walking barefoot to a distant shrine or carrying a heavy cross through the streets, were common, serving as both punishment and public shaming. These acts, sanctioned by the church, reinforced social control and ensured the community's awareness of divine judgment. For certain crimes deemed especially heinous, more extreme measures were taken, often overlapping with secular punishments. Burning at the stake, for instance, was a punishment frequently used for heresy, a crime directly under the jurisdiction of the church, often justified under the cloak of divine retribution. The paradox of the church's involvement is striking. While advocating for mercy and forgiveness, it simultaneously sanctioned brutal and often disproportionate punishments. The discrepancy stemmed from the church's dual role as a spiritual guide and a powerful temporal institution. Its pursuit of spiritual purity sometimes clashed with its pragmatic need to maintain order and control, resulting in a justice system that was simultaneously pious and profoundly cruel. The church's moral pronouncements, while sometimes ostensibly aiming towards righteousness, could be manipulated and twisted to serve the interests of the powerful. Accusations of heresy, for example, could be used to eliminate political opponents or silence dissenting voices. The very ambiguity of divine justice allowed for considerable latitude in the interpretation and application of punishment, leaving the accused vulnerable to arbitrary and often capricious sentencing. Consider the medieval obsession with witchcraft. The Church's pronouncements on the reality of witchcraft and the gravity of the sin fueled widespread witch hunts, resulting in the torture and execution of countless women and some men. The horrifying rituals of these trials, often overseen by ecclesiastical figures, stand as a chilling testament to how religious fervor can be twisted into instruments of oppression and violence. The lack of due process, the reliance on confessions extracted through torture, often with the tacit approval or active participation of church officials, and the sheer brutality of the punishments highlight the darkest aspects of medieval justice. The absence of standardized procedures in both secular and ecclesiastical courts further exacerbated the problems. While some attempts were made at codifying canon law, inconsistencies remained, allowing considerable leeway for personal interpretation and biases to influence outcomes. The social standing of the accused remained a major factor, influencing the severity of the punishment disproportionately. The rich and well-connected could often buy their way out of trouble, while the poor and vulnerable were left at the mercy of a system that often showed little regard for fairness or proportionality. The legacy of the Church's involvement in medieval justice remains a complex and troubling issue. While it provided a moral framework for understanding crime and punishment, Its influence often resulted in the unjust and brutal treatment of many. The intertwining of spiritual and secular authority created a system rife with inconsistencies, contradictions, and a stark disregard for human rights. It is a dark chapter in the history of justice, a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of combining religious fervor with unchecked power. The medieval obsession with divine retribution, far from offering a path to salvation, often led to a path paved with suffering, injustice, and the grotesque perversion of justice. It is a reminder that even institutions dedicated to righteousness can at times be instruments of terrible cruelty. The pursuit of justice, even informed by the highest ideals, requires vigilance and a constant commitment to fairness, accountability, and the inalienable rights of the individual, a lesson that resonates even today. The clang of iron on iron, the rasp of chains, the stench of sickness and despair, these were the constant companions of medieval prison life. But within those grim walls, a flicker of defiance often burned. Hope, however faint, could ignite the spark of rebellion, fueling desperate attempts to escape the suffocating grip of incarceration. These acts of defiance, however fleeting, offer a glimpse into the resilience of the human spirit, a testament to the enduring desire for freedom, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Escaping a medieval prison was akin to navigating a labyrinth of death. The walls, typically thick and unforgiving, were often guarded by armed personnel, their vigilance varying depending on the perceived threat posed by the inmates. The sheer density of the prisons, teeming with bodies and disease, sometimes acted as an inadvertent aid, providing cover and confusion in the desperate dash for freedom. One might imagine a chaotic scene of scrambling limbs, hushed whispers, and the frantic exchange of tools fashioned from scraps of metal and bone, a macabre workshop of desperation. Consider the ingenuity involved. A cleverly concealed tunnel, dug inch by inch over weeks or months, using nothing but spoons, fingernails, and the sheer force of will. The slow, painstaking work, done under the cover of darkness, punctuated only by the occasional cough or the squeak of a rat. An act of defiance played out in the heart of confinement. Success meant a gamble on life and death, often facing the grim reality of recapture, with the harshest punishments meted out to those who failed in their audacious attempts. Stories whispered in the dark, tales of successful escapes, fed the fragile hope, a lifeline in a sea of despair. Sometimes, luck played a role, a fortuitous circumstance aligning with desperate courage, a careless guard, a momentary lapse in vigilance, a raging storm that disrupts the routine, even a sudden outbreak of disease, diverting attention away from a carefully planned escape. These opportunities, however rare, were seized with the ferocity of desperation, a desperate scramble for freedom against the brutal reality of the system. But escape attempts were not always solitary ventures. Prison rebellions, though rare and incredibly dangerous, sometimes erupted, fueled by the collective desperation of numerous prisoners. These were not coordinated uprisings, orchestrated with military precision. Rather, they were eruptions of raw anger, born from hunger, brutality, and the crushing weight of despair. A spontaneous riot might erupt over a meager meal, a particularly vicious beating, or simply the unbearable weight of imprisonment itself. These moments of collective defiance, however short-lived, demonstrated the prisoner's capacity to resist, to challenge the authority that held them captive. These were brutal affairs, fraught with violence and characterized by the immense power imbalance between the prisoners and the guards. The brutality of the guards' response was often as significant as the rebellion itself. The sheer number of prisoners often made it difficult for the guards to immediately suppress such uprisings, leading to moments of chaotic struggle, close quarters combat, with improvised weapons clashing against guards' staves and swords. The aftermath of such rebellions was invariably grim, swift, and harsh reprisals that demonstrated the authorities' iron will to maintain control. The punishment meted out to those involved in failed escape attempts or rebellions was often brutal and disproportionate, serving as a stark warning to others. The severity of the punishment depended on several factors, including the perceived seriousness of the attempt, the social standing of the prisoner, and the whims of the authorities. Increased prison time, floggings, branding, and even death were common punishments. One can imagine the grim spectacle: prisoners, their bodies scarred and broken, being publicly flogged as a chilling reminder of the futility of resistance. The spectacle served not only as punishment, but also as a deterrent, a way to crush any hint of dissent. But alongside these stories of failure, there were also whispered legends of successful escapes, tales that thrived in the darkness of the cells, passed down from generation to generation of prisoners, fueling hope and inspiring others to contemplate their own audacious bids for freedom. These stories, often embellished over time, served as potent reminders of the possibility of escape, a powerful antidote to the pervasive hopelessness of prison life. One might imagine a prisoner, resourceful and clever, utilizing his knowledge of the prison layout, exploiting weaknesses in the security system, forging alliances with fellow prisoners, and even bribing guards, a dangerous game with life or death stakes. Success wasn't guaranteed. The odds were stacked against them, but the possibility, however slim, was enough to sustain their desperate efforts. These individuals, driven by a powerful desire for freedom, became symbols of hope and defiance within the confines of the prison walls. The successful escapes often involved meticulous planning, an intimate knowledge of the prison's architecture, and a healthy dose of luck. A network of contacts on the outside, willing to offer assistance after the escape, was equally crucial. One can imagine the clandestine meetings, the whispered promises, the exchange of vital information, a network of complicity spanning the prison walls. The escape itself might involve intricate maneuvers, exploiting weak points in the security, utilizing disguises, and relying on the element of surprise. The narratives of escape and rebellion weren't just individual stories. They were a reflection of the larger social and political context. These acts of defiance underscored the brutal realities of medieval justice, the arbitrary power of the authorities, and the utter lack of rights afforded to prisoners. They highlighted the inherent inequalities of the system, with the privileged often receiving lenient treatment, while the poor and vulnerable faced the full brunt of the law's harshness. The stories of escape and rebellion offer a complex and nuanced perspective on the medieval prison system. They reveal a grim reality that belied the romanticized image often portrayed in popular culture. The prisoners were not passive victims, they were active agents, fighting for survival and freedom, using their wit, courage, and ingenuity to challenge the system designed to crush them. Their stories, however brutal, serve as a powerful reminder of the human spirit's enduring capacity for hope and defiance, even in the darkest of circumstances. Their struggles for freedom, their daring attempts to reclaim their agency, remain a testament to the power of the human will in the face of overwhelming oppression. The legacy of these rebels, these escapees, lives on, a stark reminder of the inherent human desire for liberty. Chapter 3: A Glimmer of Light, Medieval Justice and Its Legacy. The flickering candlelight of a medieval prison cell casts long, dancing shadows on the damp stone walls, a stark contrast to the sterile fluorescence of a modern cell. Yet, despite the obvious differences in aesthetics, a chilling similarity persists: the confinement of human beings, stripped of their freedom. While centuries separate the two systems, the fundamental question remains: how much have we truly progressed in our treatment of those incarcerated? The answer, unfortunately, is nuanced and far from a resounding very much. Medieval prisons, as we've explored, were places of unimaginable squalor, rife with disease, starvation, and brutal violence. Overcrowding was the norm, not the exception, with prisoners often crammed into spaces designed for a fraction of their number. Hygiene was a forgotten luxury, sanitation non existent. The stench of decay, a potent cocktail of human waste, rotting food, and festering wounds, hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the dehumanizing conditions. The absence of basic medical care meant that even minor injuries could easily become fatal. Death, in short, was a frequent visitor. Modern prisons, while vastly improved in many respects, still grapple with challenges that echo those of their medieval predecessors. Overcrowding, a persistent problem in many jurisdictions, leads to similar strains on resources and an exacerbation of existing issues. While modern sanitation standards are, thankfully, far superior, the potential for disease outbreaks remains a concern, particularly in facilities with inadequate ventilation or cleaning protocols. The sheer scale of some modern prisons presents its own unique problems, creating a bureaucratic maze that can hinder the provision of adequate health care, mental health services, and rehabilitation programs. The legacy of medieval neglect still haunts us, even in our advanced systems. Let's consider the issue of health care. While medieval prisoners received virtually no medical attention, their modern counterparts have access, in theory, to medical services. However, access does not always equate to quality. The quality of care in many prisons is often subpar, hampered by budget constraints, understaffing, and bureaucratic hurdles. Mental health care, especially, is consistently underserved, leaving many inmates vulnerable to mental illness with inadequate support. This is a stark reminder that progress, even when significant, can be uneven and painfully slow. The lack of consistent and adequate health care is a cruel echo of the past. Furthermore, While physical torture was, theoretically, banished long ago, the potential for psychological abuse remains a deeply disturbing aspect of modern incarceration. Solitary confinement, for instance, can inflict immense psychological damage, its impact echoing the isolation and despair experienced by medieval prisoners. The sheer boredom, sensory deprivation, and crushing loneliness in solitary are potent tools of control capable of shattering the human spirit. The severity of prolonged isolation rivals the torturous conditions of the medieval dungeon in its lasting psychological scars. The concept of rehabilitation, almost entirely absent in the medieval era, is a cornerstone of modern penal theory. However, its implementation often falls drastically short of its lofty ideals. Resources are often stretched thin, leaving rehabilitation programs underfunded and understaffed. The emphasis on punishment rather than rehabilitation remains a significant obstacle. For many inmates, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, imprisonment becomes a cycle of confinement, reoffending, and repeated incarceration, perpetuating a vicious cycle of poverty, criminality, and social exclusion. The concept of rehabilitation remains a utopian ideal, often failing to mitigate the systemic issues that lead individuals to crime in the first place. The comparison extends beyond material conditions to encompass the broader legal framework. Medieval justice was arbitrary, often capricious, and subject to the whims of the powerful. The absence of due process, the prevalence of torture to extract confessions, and the complete lack of prisoner rights created a system where innocence or guilt were matters of little consequence. Modern justice systems, while far from perfect, possess safeguards designed to protect the rights of the accused, including the right to legal representation, a fair trial, and protection against cruel and unusual punishment. However, this progress isn't universally applied. Bias in sentencing, disparities in access to legal resources, and the disproportionate incarceration of marginalized groups continue to plague modern systems. The legacy of systemic inequality persists, mirroring the biases inherent in medieval systems. The modern prison system often disproportionately affects marginalized communities and reflects the broader societal inequalities it claims to address. This is not merely a matter of flawed policies, but also a matter of deeply ingrained biases. The sheer scale and complexity of modern prisons also present challenges unique to our era. The bureaucratic labyrinth, the challenges of managing large populations, and the logistical demands of maintaining security all contribute to the inherent challenges of the system. While technology has improved security measures, reducing the reliance on brutal physical force, it has also created new forms of surveillance and control, raising concerns about privacy and the potential for abuse. The scale of these modern institutions creates logistical complexities far beyond the scale of the smaller medieval dungeons. But these logistical challenges often impact the basic dignity and human rights of those incarcerated. In conclusion, while the stark contrast between medieval and modern prisons is undeniable, the absence of basic sanitation and health care in the former versus the theoretically superior conditions of the latter, the comparison highlights a disturbing continuity. The problems of overcrowding, Insufficient resources, the neglect of mental health, and systemic biases continue to plague contemporary systems, echoing the shortcomings of their medieval predecessors. The progress made is significant and undeniably a cause for celebration. However, it's vital to acknowledge the persistence of deep rooted systemic inequalities and ongoing challenges that require continuous critical examination and reform. The grim realities of the medieval prison system serve as a stark reminder that the fight for just and humane treatment of incarcerated individuals is far from over. The journey towards a truly just and rehabilitative system remains a work in progress, a testament to the enduring struggle for justice and human dignity. The specter of the medieval prison, with its brutal indifference to human suffering, serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to remain vigilant and committed to the ongoing reform of our penal institutions. The past is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a potent reminder of the fragility of progress and the ever present need for vigilance. The path towards a truly just system is long and arduous, but the echoes of those dark dungeons should serve as a constant spur to action. The grim picture painted by the medieval prison, a festering wound on the body of society, wasn't entirely without its glimmers of light. While the dominant narrative was one of brutal indifference, seeds of reform were sown, taking root in the fertile ground of burgeoning moral and philosophical changes. These weren't grand revolutions, but rather subtle shifts, incremental adjustments in a system deeply entrenched in violence and injustice. They were like wildflowers pushing through cracks in a cobblestone street, tenacious and fragile, a testament to the enduring human capacity for empathy, even in the darkest of times. One of the earliest discernible shifts was a gradual, albeit uneven, decline in the prevalence of physical torture as a standard method of extracting confessions. While torture remained a horrifying reality for centuries, its application became subject to increasing scrutiny. This wasn't due to any sudden surge of humanitarian concern, but rather a confluence of factors. One contributing element was the growing awareness among some legal professionals that coerced confessions were unreliable. A false confession, however brutally obtained, held little value in a system that increasingly aimed for at least a semblance of justice. This wasn't driven by altruism, of course. The flawed nature of obtaining a confession by torture and its possible impact on the whole process began to be more apparent to those who were invested in the system working. It's a fascinating example of cold, hard pragmatism pushing the envelope of reform rather than the idealistic desire for a less brutal system. Another factor was the rise of canon law, with its emphasis on the spiritual well-being of the accused. The Church, while hardly a paragon of virtue itself, increasingly advocated for more merciful treatment of prisoners, subtly influencing the legal landscape. Clerical intervention often resulted in mitigating sentences or securing pardons, offering a form of protection against the harshest punishments. This wasn't necessarily based on compassion. Maintaining the soul's purity of the accused was highly valued, and that involved reducing the risk of condemning an innocent person to eternal damnation due to an erroneous verdict secured by torture. The development of more formalized legal procedures, however flawed, also contributed to the slow erosion of unchecked brutality. The increasing emphasis on due process, though often unevenly applied and easily circumvented, meant that some semblance of fairness was gradually introduced into the system. The rudimentary establishment of procedures, however arbitrary or biased, did create a system in which it was harder to simply apply the most brutal punishments without any process. This provided at least a minor check against the most egregious abuses. Think of it as a clumsy medieval version of a procedural safeguard. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always applied consistently, but its very existence marked a step towards something better. The incremental nature of this improvement shouldn't be discounted. Progress, even in the most brutal environments, takes time. The emergence of early forms of legal representation also played a crucial role. While not the sophisticated system we know today, the gradual rise of advocates, often wealthy individuals or members of the clergy, acting on behalf of the accused, provided a measure of protection against arbitrary judgment. Their role was primarily to plead for leniency, to navigate the labyrinthine complexities of the legal system, and to negotiate with judges and officials, not unlike modern lawyers, yet operating within a far more brutal and arbitrary framework. The presence of an advocate, even one operating within the same corrupt system, had some minimal effect on the potential for abuse. The implementation of fines as an alternative to corporal punishment represented another significant, though often class-based, step towards reform. While fines disproportionately affected the poor, who might face imprisonment or other brutal punishment for not paying them, they offered an alternative to the physical pain inflicted on other members of society. This was, in essence, a shift from an emphasis on inflicting physical suffering to a focus on extracting economic compensation, a subtle but important change in the mentality of the justice system. It may seem a cynical reform, but the introduction of financial penalties marked a slow retreat from outright brutal violence. The concept of sanctuary, though more closely associated with religious institutions, also offered a form of protection for those accused of crimes. Seeking refuge within a church or monastery provided temporary immunity from arrest and trial, allowing individuals time to negotiate their situation or even escape entirely. While this system was frequently abused and could lead to its own issues, offering refuge for the accused, whether innocent or guilty, was a testament to the existence of compassion. It allowed those condemned to the brutal system time to either escape entirely or gather the necessary means to petition the authorities or the church and improve their chances of a lighter sentence. Even prison conditions, though horrific, witnessed sporadic improvements. While overcrowded, unsanitary dungeons remained the norm. Some institutions began to implement rudimentary reforms, such as the occasional provision of basic food or a separation of different categories of prisoners. This was often driven by practical concerns, such as preventing disease outbreaks within the prison population, rather than any genuine concern for the well-being of the prisoners themselves. This may seem an insignificant shift, but the provision of some food, however meager, or even the attempt at disease prevention, pointed towards a degree of change in the system itself. However, it's crucial to temper our enthusiasm for these reforms. They were incremental, unevenly applied, and often deeply flawed. The system remained brutal, capricious, and heavily biased against the poor and marginalized. The seeds of reform were sown in a deeply hostile environment, and their growth was slow and often stunted. The legal frameworks implemented were frequently utilized for exploitation and oppression rather than as intended. The humanization of punishment was therefore a highly uneven and imperfect process. The slow decline in the use of torture, the rise of legal representation for those who could afford it, and the occasional provision of basic needs within prisons were significant steps. But they were far from a comprehensive overhaul of a system deeply rooted in violence and inequality. Justice remained a privilege, not a right, and the most vulnerable members of society continued to bear the brunt of a system that was, at its core, designed to maintain and perpetuate existing hierarchies. The legacy of medieval justice is therefore complex and contradictory. The sheer brutality of the system is undeniable, yet within its dark heart lay the nascent seeds of reform, a testament to the persistence of hope and the enduring human capacity for change. It was a long and arduous journey, one that is far from over. The grim realities of the past serve not only as a cautionary tale, but also as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can reach out for the light, slowly and painstakingly, striving for a more just and humane future. The struggle for justice is an eternal one, and the medieval era, with all its brutality, offers a sobering, yet ultimately instructive, perspective on the path we have traversed and the journey that lies ahead. The echoes of those medieval dungeons, with their horrors and fleeting glimmers of hope, should serve as a powerful reminder of the enduring fight for justice and human dignity. The echoes of medieval justice reverberate surprisingly loudly in the halls of our modern legal systems. While we've thankfully shed the more overtly barbaric practices, the public floggings, the gruesome executions, the casual disregard for human life, the underlying structures and mindsets often remain, subtly shaping our contemporary approaches to crime and punishment. This isn't to say that we've made no progress. The evolution from the medieval dungeon to the modern prison, however flawed the latter may be, represents a monumental shift. Yet, a closer examination reveals a troubling continuity, a long shadow cast by centuries of brutal practices. Consider, for instance, the enduring concept of retribution. Medieval justice, steeped in theocratic ideologies and a belief in divine vengeance, emphasized punishment as a means of exacting retribution for wrongdoing. While our modern systems often cloak this retributive impulse in the language of deterrence or rehabilitation, the underlying desire to make them pay, to inflict suffering commensurate with the perceived crime, persists. The very concept of prison sentences, measured in years and decades of confinement, mirrors the medieval obsession with proportionality, albeit expressed through the arguably more civilized language of incarceration instead of physical torture. This isn't to say that retribution should be entirely eradicated from the criminal justice system. The need for accountability is a fundamental principle. However, the underlying ethos, the subtle satisfaction derived from seeing someone punished, carries the disturbing aroma of medieval vengeance. The problem extends beyond the philosophy of punishment to encompass the very structure of the legal system itself. The medieval system, for all its brutality, operated on a foundation of hierarchy and inequality. The wealthy and powerful often enjoyed significant advantages, escaping the full weight of the law or receiving lenient sentences, while the poor and marginalized bore the brunt of its harshness. This disparity, though often less overt in its expression today, continues to plague modern legal frameworks. The unequal access to quality legal representation, the disproportionate incarceration rates of marginalized communities, and the systemic biases that permeate the judicial process all echo the injustices of the medieval period. The rich could afford better lawyers, essentially purchasing their way out of the harshest punishments. The poor had no such recourse and suffered the full wrath of the law. While we may not have open-air torture sessions, systemic biases create a similar level of inequality and injustice. Furthermore, the medieval obsession with confession, often extracted through torture, finds a parallel in our modern preoccupation with plea bargains. While these bargains ostensibly offer expediency and efficiency, they also often pressure individuals, particularly the vulnerable, to plead guilty even when innocent. The pressure to plead guilty, rather than face the potentially devastating consequences of a protracted and potentially unfair trial, often leads to wrongful convictions. The historical roots of this practice in the medieval system of extracting confessions are worth remembering. The system of plea bargains mirrors the medieval emphasis on confession, even if the methods of obtaining them are less immediately brutal. The enduring influence of medieval thought also manifests in societal attitudes towards crime and punishment. The medieval period's deeply ingrained fear of disorder and a penchant for harsh, public displays of authority profoundly impacted the public mindset. The medieval punishment was not only a method of justice, but also a theatrical display intended to dissuade others from committing similar acts. While we no longer have public executions, the media's fascination with high-profile criminal cases and the sensationalized coverage they receive suggests a lingering appetite for such spectacles. The public interest in such morbid detail, a hunger to see the guilty punished, directly feeds into the medieval tendency to use punishment as a public display of power. Moreover, the stigma attached to a criminal record, the difficulty individuals face in reintegrating into society after incarceration, all reflect the medieval notion of permanent social exclusion for those deemed to have violated the social order. The medieval punishments and stigmas often resulted in permanent social exclusion. Excommunication, branding, and similar punishments destroyed a person's social life and economic prospects. Modern society, despite its purportedly rehabilitative goals, sometimes mirrors the harsh penalties of the medieval system. A criminal conviction, once obtained, can create almost insurmountable barriers to housing, employment, and access to various social services. Even the architecture of our prisons bears a faint resemblance to their medieval predecessors. The emphasis on confinement, isolation, and surveillance, characteristics of modern correctional facilities, finds its historical precedent in the grim and suffocating dungeons of the medieval era. While modern prisons are, in theory, designed to rehabilitate rather than simply punish, the physical environment, the cold, Sterile cells, the rigid routines, the constant monitoring still resonates with the spirit of medieval confinement. The sense of oppression, the loss of autonomy and agency, echoes the medieval prison system, even if expressed in a less brutally obvious way. Finally, the very idea of incarceration as the primary form of punishment, its acceptance as a seemingly normal and even humane solution to crime, represents a continuation of medieval practices, albeit on a vastly different scale. Imprisonment, despite its modern veneer, can be seen as a direct descendant of the medieval dungeon. While medieval dungeons were primarily places of detention before trial or execution, the concept of long-term incarceration, though applied much more extensively, has a distinct medieval lineage. The modern prison continues the medieval system's focus on physical confinement as the most important aspect of punishment, even if the underlying philosophies have changed. The comparison isn't meant to trivialize the vast differences between medieval and modern penal systems. The absence of systematic torture, the existence of legal rights, however imperfectly enforced, and the theoretical pursuit of rehabilitation represent significant advancements. However, the enduring influence of medieval conceptions of justice, subtly woven into the fabric of our contemporary systems, demands reflection and critical examination. The long shadow of the past extends far beyond the dungeons of old. It continues to shape our understanding of crime, punishment, and the very nature of justice itself. It is a reminder of our continuing struggle to fully escape the darker aspects of our shared history, a struggle that demands constant vigilance and persistent reform. The specter of those medieval dungeons should haunt us, not merely as a reminder of brutality overcome, but also as a cautionary tale of how easily the echoes of the past can shape our present. The fight for truly just and humane justice continues, and understanding this historical continuity is crucial to achieving that goal. The chilling legacy of medieval prisons extends far beyond the musty walls and rat-infested dungeons. It's a legacy etched into the very fabric of our societal attitudes towards crime, punishment, and the elusive ideal of justice. While we may shudder at the graphic descriptions of medieval torture and execution, the more subtle and insidious aspects of that era's justice system persist, reminding us that progress, while undeniable, is often uneven and incomplete. The belief that we have entirely escaped the medieval mindset is a dangerous illusion. It's a comforting fairy tale that obscures the enduring problems within our own systems. One striking parallel lies in the persistent focus on retribution. Medieval justice, deeply rooted in theocratic beliefs and a thirst for divine vengeance, saw punishment as an act of proportional recompense. While our modern legal systems strive for a veneer of sophistication, employing terms like deterrence and rehabilitation, the underlying impulse to make them pay remains remarkably similar. The length of prison sentences, meticulously calculated to match the severity of the crime, eerily mirrors the medieval obsession with proportionality, even if expressed in a less overtly brutal manner. A life sentence for murder, for example, evokes the medieval logic of an eye for an eye, albeit in a prolonged, drawn-out version. This isn't necessarily wrong. Accountability is vital. However, the implicit satisfaction derived from witnessing punishment, the subtle thrill of retribution, echoes the medieval thirst for vengeance. It's a chilling reminder that even our most civilized systems retain a dark undercurrent inherited from a more savage past. Furthermore, the medieval legal system's inherent inequalities find disturbing echoes in our own time. The wealthy and powerful of the medieval era frequently enjoyed preferential treatment, escaping the full force of the law, while the poor and marginalized faced the brunt of its harshness. This grotesque disparity, although less blatant in its modern expression, persists in various subtle and insidious ways. The unequal access to competent legal representation, for example, ensures that the wealthy can effectively buy their way out of trouble, securing high priced lawyers who can navigate the complexities of the legal system with ease. The poor, lacking resources, are often left to face the system alone, often with overworked and underpaid public defenders. This stark inequality renders the promise of equal justice under the law a cruel mockery for many. The disproportionate incarceration rates of minorities, the prevalence of systemic biases within the justice system, all serve as grim reminders of the persistent legacy of inequality that has plagued justice systems for centuries. The medieval system didn't merely punish, it punished differently based on social standing, and that underlying principle, sadly, remains far too relevant today. The insidious influence of medieval justice extends to the realm of plea bargains. The medieval obsession with confession, often extracted through the most brutal methods imaginable, finds a disconcerting parallel in the pressure applied during modern plea bargaining. The expediency and efficiency of plea bargains are often touted, but what is frequently overlooked is the coercive nature of the system. Individuals, especially those facing lengthy trials and severe penalties, are frequently pressured to accept a guilty plea, even if innocent, in order to avoid a protracted and potentially unfair trial. The overwhelming pressure exerted, the potential for wrongful convictions stemming from these circumstances, resonates directly with the medieval approach of securing confessions, regardless of their veracity. The methods may have evolved, becoming less obviously brutal, but the underlying principle remains frighteningly familiar. The medieval mindset wasn't merely about the formal structure of the law, it seeped into societal attitudes towards crime and punishment. The medieval period's inherent fear of disorder and its penchant for public displays of authority profoundly shaped public perception. Public executions weren't simply punishments, they were theatrical spectacles designed to instill fear and reinforce the authority of the state. Although we don't have public executions anymore, our media's fascination with high-profile criminal cases, the insatiable public appetite for details of heinous crimes, suggests a lingering desire for precisely this kind of public spectacle. The constant media coverage often serves less to inform and more to satisfy the public's dark fascination, mirroring the medieval drive to use punishment as a public demonstration of power and control. This morbid fascination speaks volumes about the enduring impact of medieval societal conditioning. The enduring stigma associated with a criminal record, the substantial barriers to reintegration faced by formerly incarcerated individuals, further reflects the medieval notion of permanent social exclusion. Medieval punishments often resulted in social ostracism, excommunication, branding, and similar practices effectively destroyed a person's social life and economic prospects. Modern society, despite its purported commitment to rehabilitation, sometimes resembles the harshest elements of the medieval system. A criminal record often becomes an insurmountable obstacle, limiting access to housing, employment, and various social services, creating a cycle of poverty and recidivism. The medieval system effectively condemned individuals to a life outside the social fabric. Our current system, although ostensibly more nuanced, can achieve a similar outcome through systemic barriers and social stigma. Even the architecture of our modern prisons bears a faint resemblance to their medieval predecessors. The emphasis on confinement, isolation, and constant surveillance in our correctional facilities echoes the dark, claustrophobic dungeons of the past. Although modern prisons are theoretically designed to rehabilitate rather than solely punish, the oppressive atmosphere, the sterile cells, the rigid routines, the constant monitoring retains a medieval resonance. The loss of autonomy, the pervading sense of oppression, harks back to the spirit of medieval confinement. Even if masked by a seemingly more sophisticated approach, the persistence of incarceration as the primary mode of punishment, its acceptance as a relatively humane solution, represents another direct link to medieval practices. While medieval dungeons primarily served as holding cells before trial or execution, the concept of extended imprisonment, implemented on a far grander scale, remains a direct descendant of that system. The modern prison, despite its modern facade, maintains the medieval focus on physical confinement as the primary method of punishment, even if the underlying philosophies have ostensibly evolved. The comparison isn't about minimizing the considerable differences between medieval and modern penal systems. The absence of systematic torture, the existence of legal rights, however imperfectly applied, and the theoretical pursuit of rehabilitation represent significant progress. However, the enduring influence of medieval conceptions of justice, subtly woven into the fabric of contemporary systems, demands rigorous reflection and sustained critical examination. The long shadow of the past continues to shape our understanding of crime, punishment, and the very concept of justice. It is a sobering reminder of our ongoing struggle to escape the darker aspects of our shared history. It is a struggle that requires constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to reform. The echoes of those medieval dungeons should serve not simply as a reminder of brutality overcome, but as a persistent cautionary tale. The pursuit of a truly just and humane justice system is an ongoing battle, and understanding this historical continuity is indispensable to achieving that goal. The past is not dead, it's not even past. It continues to haunt us, to shape us, and to demand our attention. So, there you have it, a whirlwind tour through the delightfully unpleasant world of medieval justice. We've traversed fetid dungeons, witnessed ludicrous punishments, and examined the surprisingly enduring legacy of this bygone era. If you're feeling a little queasy, don't worry. It's a perfectly normal reaction to contemplating the sheer, unadulterated awfulness of it all. But before we bid a fond and slightly terrified farewell, Let's linger a moment longer, contemplating the lingering questions that this historical sojourn inevitably raises. One might be tempted, perhaps even encouraged by the sheer scale of the horror, to simply declare a resounding victory. Thank goodness, we've moved on from those barbaric times. But such triumphant declarations, while emotionally satisfying, risk glossing over a crucial point. The evolution of justice is a messy, uneven process. It's not a linear progression from brutal darkness to enlightened fairness, but rather a chaotic dance between progress and regression, marked by occasional leaps forward, punctuated by frustrating steps back. Consider, for instance, the enduring power of the spectacle. While we've thankfully banished public executions, our modern media is a relentless machine churning out narratives of crime and punishment, satisfying a public appetite for the macabre that echoes the medieval thirst for public displays of authority. The 24-hour news cycle, with its relentless coverage of high-profile trials and lurid details of heinous crimes, plays a role eerily similar to those medieval public executions, fueling a morbid fascination that reinforces societal hierarchies and anxieties. We may not have the stocks and pillory, but we have the constant barrage of media coverage, offering a similar, if subtly different, form of public shaming and reaffirmation of societal power structures. Moreover, the persistence of class inequality within our own justice systems mirrors the blatant disparities of the medieval era, albeit in more sophisticated and insidious ways. While the medieval lord might have simply bought his way out of a punishment, the modern equivalent involves expensive legal representation, strategic plea bargains, and the influence of political connections. The poor, meanwhile, lack the resources to navigate the complexities of the legal system, often facing overworked public defenders and the weight of systemic biases. The promise of equal justice under the law becomes a cruel jest for those lacking the means to afford a fair trial. And let's not forget the insidious pressure of plea bargains. The medieval emphasis on confession, often extracted through torture, has a disturbingly close parallel in the coercive pressures of modern plea negotiations. The expediency of a plea bargain is frequently praised, but the inherent power imbalance often forces innocent individuals to accept guilt to avoid the dawning prospect of a lengthy and potentially unfair trial. The modern courtroom may be less physically violent, but the psychological pressure can be just as effective in securing a guilty plea, regardless of the truth. This isn't to suggest that our current system is identical to its medieval counterpart. Far from it. The existence of formalized legal rights, the theoretically impartial judicial system, and the often unfulfilled aspiration towards rehabilitation mark significant progress. The absence of widespread systematic torture is a crucial difference, a testament to the long and arduous struggle against barbarity. However, acknowledging the substantial improvements doesn't negate the enduring echoes of the past. The subtle ways in which medieval ideas persist should not be dismissed as mere historical curiosities. They are active, dynamic forces that continue to shape our understanding of justice. Think about the architecture of our prisons. While vastly different in their specifics, the underlying principle of confinement, isolation, and surveillance bears a striking resemblance to those medieval dungeons. The emphasis on control, the strict routines, the oppressive atmosphere. These elements resonate with the medieval spirit of confinement, even if the materials and methodology have evolved. The feeling of being stripped of autonomy, of being subjected to the absolute power of the state, persists across centuries, a chilling testament to the enduring power of the carceral system. The very concept of incarceration as the primary form of punishment, its widespread acceptance as the humane alternative to past brutalities, represents a direct link to medieval practices. Medieval dungeons may have served as holding cells before trial and execution, but the prolonged imprisonment of modern penitentiaries is their direct descendant, albeit on a much grander and more formalized scale. We might use the language of rehabilitation, but the fundamental principle of extended confinement as punishment remains remarkably similar. The comparison between medieval and modern justice is not an exercise in minimizing progress or advocating for a return to the Dark Ages. It's a call for critical self-reflection, a reminder that the past is never truly past. The subtleties of its influence are often overlooked, masked by the more obvious differences between then and now. The medieval world offers a distorted mirror, reflecting back our own anxieties, our own biases, our own lingering fascination with the spectacle of punishment. By recognizing these echoes, we can better understand the challenges we still face in the pursuit of a truly just and equitable justice system. The pursuit of justice isn't a destination, it's a continuous process. It's a constant negotiation between ideals and realities, between our aspirations and the harsh constraints of our own flawed human nature. The dark humor woven throughout this exploration of medieval justice serves not to trivialize the suffering of the past, but rather to illuminate the absurdity of certain aspects of human behavior, aspects that persist even in the seemingly more enlightened present. To truly appreciate the progress made, we must first acknowledge the terrifying distance we've traveled. The medieval era offers a stark reminder of the horrors that can occur when compassion and reason are replaced by fear, prejudice, and a thirst for vengeance. It is in the uncomfortable confrontation with the past, in the recognition of those lingering shadows, that we find the strength and the resolve to continue the fight for a fairer, more just, and ultimately more humane future. The journey towards a truly just society is a marathon, not a sprint, and understanding our past is essential to navigating the complex and challenging road ahead. Let the echoes of those medieval dungeons serve not only as a warning, but also as a call to constant vigilance and renewed commitment to the ongoing pursuit of justice. The struggle for a truly just and equitable system continues, and only by grappling with the uncomfortable realities of the past can we truly hope to build a brighter future. The work is far from over. The echoes persist.